This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by The Reconstructionist by Jonathan J. Foster. With so much changing in our society around sexuality, authority, patriarchy, religion, truth, and more, what we need is a book to help us navigate those changes while keeping love at the forefront. The Reconstructionist is that kind of book. Pick a copy up today on Amazon or any other fine digital retailer. The Reconstructionist. People greater than text, mercy greater than sacrifice, and love greater than fear.
The majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation. We could actually change as a people.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
That can't be the gospel because God said to love our neighbors.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
Just to begin questioning is so difficult because you have these voices in your ears telling you that you're not a real Christian.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we have conversations with those who are going through dark nights or deconstruction. Amanda Tyler, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's great to have you here today.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of stressful times, especially for people in our work. I'm a pastor. You are president of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So there's a lot of stress in the world. There's a lot of stress in our work. I was wondering, what is your go-to comfort food after a long day of reading the news and figuring out how we're going to respond to things? What's your go-to comfort thing?
That's good. I think I found that I was comforting myself a little too much with comfort food, and I've kind of gotten more into really trying to have a more balanced diet these days, and really try to get the protein I need to sustain me in what has been, I think, a very full season. Sometimes, life gets a little out of balance. And so sorry I don't have but lately I'm just like I made a great turkey chili this week that I just loved. And even better, everyone in my family loved it. Those are the hard things to hit. So that felt comforting and nourishing at the same time.
Oh, nice. I'm with you. I probably gained a little bit too much weight over this past year, going to the comfort foods too much. And now we just started Lent. We're on week 2 coming up here in Lent. And so I decided to give up potato chips because that was like my thing. And what else? And doom scrolling on the Facebook Reels. I gave up that for Lent too.
Those both seem like very healthy habits to pick up in this time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been trying to displace, not just make a vacuum, but displace it with something better. In place of chips, I'm doing pickles. I can eat pickles because you still kind of get the crunch and the salt, so you're good there. And then I watch The Simpsons. If I'm doom scrolling and I'm wait, I'm doom scrolling on the Reels, I got to jump into an episode of The Simpsons instead. So that's been my go-to comfort things, but then also trying to be a little bit healthier on the other side as well. Well, I want to know, I know that you kind of run this organization. I want to get into all of that because that's a topic that really interests me, but I want to know really what kind of soil did your life grow up out of, and how did faith play a part in that, if any?
Yeah, so I am from Austin, Texas, and grew up in a family that went to a Baptist church, not just every week, but several times a week. My parents met in a Baptist Sunday school class. So just the centrality of the church to our life was something that I was very much born into. And for that, I'm very grateful because I had this very solid kind of foundation in the scripture, in Sunday school, but equally as importantly, I think, in community, in that sense that our friends Many of them came from our church. My mom taught an adult Sunday school class, and so that community was kind of circling around my family from a very early age. In my background, I am Baptist, and we practice believers' baptism. So this idea that each person makes their own profession of faith whenever they are ready to do that, that profession of faith is not forced. And mine came at age 7, and that's when I was baptized at my local church. And I think, that's a relatively early age for a believer's baptism, and I think that just kind of shows how much I really embraced my faith and understood it to be an important part of my life from a really early age. And now, it is something that has sustained me throughout my life and has continued to be a place not just of comfort, but also of challenge and community for me throughout my life. So when I went away to college, I grew up in Austin, Texas, all through growing up, and then traveled very far away to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., because I had such an interest in politics and government, but continued to be involved in faith communities, both campus faith communities and also involved in churches off campus throughout my college years, which, again, I know is not always a typical experience for kids when they go off to college. But I think also, again, speaks to just the centrality and importance to my life.
Well, here's a question I've never thought to ask anyone, but then, how did faith play in your upbringing? That's one thing, but you just mentioned you had an interest in politics. Well, how did politics shape your upbringing? Like, how did your interest in politics come, and how did that blossom into what you're doing now?
Yeah, so it's a little weird. I mean, I really have to say that it's not that it's innate, but from a super early age, I was interested in politics. And it didn't really come from my family. They were engaged, but not overly so. It wasn't like anyone in my family ran for office or was professionally involved in politics. But an anecdote that, gets repeated in my family, as a little kid, like age 5, we were giving a friend a ride to church one Sunday morning. And from the back seat, I just said, so Tom, who are you voting for city council? And he had no idea. He said, well, I don't even know who's running. At which point I told him who was running and what their platforms were. So where did that come from? I can't even explain it. But that just, I do think that kids sometimes have just kind of a direction and an interest, and mine revealed itself very early on. And then just a few years later, I think I was in 2nd grade when our state senator came for a career day and spoke to our 2nd grade class. And I was captivated. And it was in that moment that I was like, this is what I want to do. And I asked the question, how do you do this? If you want to be a state senator, how do you do it? He said, go to law school. And so it was at that moment that I said, well, I'm going to go to law school as a 2nd grader, even though I didn't have any lawyers in my family. So I just kind of got on this path because it really captured my interest from a very early age. And then, did speech and debate in high school and really found an aptitude for that, mock trial in high school. And so really followed those passions into the work, into my choice for college, and then going to law school immediately after that as well.
Oh, wow. That is really amazing. I never would have thought, as a 5-year-old, to think about who's running for city council like that. That is
most don't.
Yeah,
so that's what I
most
said.
Adults don't even do that.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, did your path ever take you into official politics as a career path, or did that go into a different direction?
Yeah, somewhat. So I did work for a member of Congress for 8 years. So this was after I'd practiced law for a few years. And I, again, member of Congress who's still serving in Congress today, Representative Lloyd Doggett, was from my hometown of Austin. And so I interned for him when I was in high school, and then again when I was in college. And then after law school, again, and a few years into my career, I went back to run his local district office, at which point, at a few different times, I took leaves of absence from the government work and actually helped out and ran his campaign as well. And then also worked for him in Washington. So, those 8 years of doing that work professionally was very formative for me. I have great respect for people who are willing to run and hold public office. I also think there's a wide chasm of difference in how well people do that job. I was very lucky to work for someone who is an incredibly talented politician, but also a dedicated public servant. And that's very inspiring to me. So I also see just the amount of sacrifice that it takes to do those things. And at this point in my life, have not felt that particular call yet to public service, though I can't rule anything out for the future.
Well, that's interesting. I like that. a little bit of a Easter egg there. Maybe one day. Wow. How was there a time when, and you can take this either direction, when your faith, like how you believed it in your head, didn't quite match what you were experiencing on the ground, or you can even take it in the political realm? Is there a time when you became disillusioned with politics before everything blew up in 2016?
Yeah. Well, and I do think this kind of gets into the topic and the work that I've been doing. There is and should be, I think, a tension between our faith, particularly our faith as Christians, and power. And politics is often about power, about who holds power and who speaks for power. I think at its best, our political system really keeps power with the people, right? The idea of we the people and in a pluralistic democracy, that the instruments of government and politics provide a structure for people to influence the policies and the society that we live in. So I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with politics and government. And also the way that our system actually runs is often weighted to the powerful, the rich, the people who can afford to have the most influence. And so I would feel that disconnect, right, in different points. Again, I was fortunate to work for a member of Congress who really did believe in power for the people and who did stand against big corporate interests. But I think that sense of greed and power should always feel in tension for people of faith, because our faith is about kind of overturning the powers of the world, right? And thinking about power in a very different way, and about really elevating and centering the needs of people who have been forgotten, oppressed, and marginalized. So I do think that there is an opportunity in government and politics to work to those ends, but also that's just not how the system has been designed. But I didn't have, and there was never this moment of, I feel like I'm having to sacrifice my faith or my religious convictions in order to do this job. I didn't have that sense of disconnect at points. But I do think if we, as Christians in the world, that we have to continually hold ourselves to account what it means to really follow Jesus in a society that has such rampant inequality and discrimination. The society we live in is not God's kingdom on earth, and I think our work is continually trying to be part of building that in a flourishing society that works for everyone, regardless of what we believe or how we worship.
Yeah, you mentioned the kingdom of God, and I grew up kind of in that fundamentalist, charismatic side of the faith, where we didn't really ever know what the kingdom of God was. Like, we didn't really do a lot of the Jesus stuff either. It was mostly Paul and an Old Testament, and supplemented with sayings of Jesus when they fit our paradigm of understandings. But we never really got into what the kingdom of God was. So in my brain, it just became synonymous for, well, that's where we go when we die, kind of a thing. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of like theological framework there that you think maybe Christian nationalism is growing out of, like a lack of understanding of the kingdom of God, or possibly something else. Do you see anything in that realm?
I mean, I definitely see some overlaps between fundamentalism and Christian nationalism, and, you know, in a number of different ways. But, you know, when I think about it, I think about the Lord's Prayer and how Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And so this idea of our work continually trying to build towards a, you know, as King and many others have said, a beloved community, a community that does reflect God's vision for all of God's children, that is not just work for later, but that is our work for now. And you know, I did not grow up in a fundamentalist background, so I didn't have kind of this focus on end times or this idea of, you know, we're just kind of, and I'm not trying to reduce to say that's what the theology is, but I think sometimes there's this idea of, you know, if we just believe certain things and live our life in a certain way, then our reward is in heaven. And this idea that exempts us from working towards justice or loving our neighbors in a way that doesn't just delay the sense of actual human flourishing, that is possible in the life that we're living now. And it is that kind of life that prepares us well for a life in eternity with Jesus. Not that it is, you know, check these boxes and therefore you will get it, but actually that we are learning to live with one another in this life that we're given on earth, and that is the reward in heaven, that we are prepared well then to live forever in that sense of love and community. So to the extent that Christian nationalism kind of takes an idea of God's will for the world and really does have it in kind of an end times frame, and that God has a special role for the United States to play in just kind of getting to the finish line, I think that does diminish the gospel and the way that Jesus lived his life on earth, that he wasn't just delaying for the future, but actually actively living to make the lives of his neighbors better in the time of great oppression, that example actually speaks very much to the times that we're living in now, if we are willing to accept it and answer that call to follow Jesus for our time and not just for some time in the future in heaven.
Yeah, that makes sense. If we can rewind a little bit, how would you, it seems really hard for me to really define Christian nationalism. It's more like a many-headed Hydra dragon kind of a thing. It's like, well, there's this, you know, expression of it and this expression of it. And then, you know, you have like neo-Nazi expression of it. And then you have like fundamental charismatic expression of it. Could you like not necessarily look at all the different heads, but if you were to get down to the unifying body of the beast, what would you say Christian nationalism is? Yeah.
And I'm going to start like one layer out and just talk about religious nationalism in general, which is just a fusion of religion and national goals and identities. And that has been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today, right? And so to think about, for instance, Christian nationalism, really thinking about that going back to the time of Constantine, when the empire assumed Christianity for its own and therefore started to define what Christianity was in empirical terms, that's where we, you know, got off track from the teachings of Jesus, that Jesus was always about, again, the marginalized and the oppressed by power, not about power himself. And so when those in power assume the mantle of Christianity and seek to define and impose it, that is a betrayal of the faith itself. But then kind of in the U.S. context, I define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities into one. Another way to say it is Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but often a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political priorities. Now, I am not saying to hold conservative political priorities means you necessarily embrace Christian nationalism, but rather if you think that to be a real American you have to hold those views, that suggests an orientation towards Christian nationalism. And the many heads of Christian nationalism, I think, is a good image. I also think about it, and this is reflected in social science surveys, as kind of orientations towards Christian nationalism. That every person has an opportunity every day to either embrace or reject Christian nationalism because it's this ideology and cultural framework that just exists in our society. And so to think about, there are gradations of it. On one end, you have people who are fully adhering to this ideology, so adherence to Christian nationalism. On the other end, you have people who are completely rejecting it, rejectors of Christian nationalism. And then you have people in the middle who are either resisting it but haven't fully rejected it, or sympathetic with it even if they aren't fully on board. And I think that kind of spectrum helps. And then for people who are really interested in digging deep, there are, even among adherents, there are, I think, different expressions of it. Some that look more political, that are more explicitly white supremacist, although I want to say that the idea of white supremacy actually pervades the entire ideology, that we can't separate that out. There are some that seem more biblically, use biblical references. Again, the more fundamentalism or reading of the Bible, but use that to kind of justify the Christian nationalism. So lots of different expressions, but I think this broad definition has at least helped me and others that I've talked to kind of get a better idea of how pervasive the problem is and learn how to spot it even when it shows up in a lot of different expressions.
I like that gradient is helpful instead of just a toggle switch. You either are or you aren't. I was talking with a friend of mine who is a Trump supporter, and we were talking about Christian nationalism, and he was like, well, what is that? And I was trying to explain it a little bit, and he's like, well, yeah, I think I might be. It's like, okay, well, but in my head it was toggle switch. It was like, you are or you aren't. It's like you reject it or you accept it, and that gradient really helps me see a little bit more. There's a little bit more color here than just on and off or black and white.
And another way I talk about it is it's not an immutable characteristic, right? It's not something that you're born with and you can't do anything about, right? It's so the more we draw our awareness to it, the more we, I think, can ground ourselves in our faith. There are opportunities to kind of move along that spectrum in both directions, by the way, right? Some people might become more adhering to it, but many people, when they're really grappling with it, particularly in community, tend to move away from it in some ways. And so I think that's a more helpful way, especially to engage in conversation. I think the other trap that those of us who are resisting or rejecting it can fall into is to think, oh, this isn't me, this isn't my problem, instead of understanding that, there are all different ways that we have kind of been complicit in the problem of Christian nationalism at different points in our life, and being able to reflect on it and have a little bit more space for self-examination without labeling, I think can really help both our own formation, but also the way that we show up in conversation and relationship with other people.
Yeah. Now, was there a time when you saw Christian nationalism and said, oh, that's it, that's the problem? Or is it something that you've been aware of for kind of a long time that's just grown in awareness? Was that a toggle switch moment, or was that more of growing in awareness of it?
Yeah, so a little bit about my professional background, how I got to this work might be a helpful frame. So the organization that I lead is called Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We are almost 90 years old, have done advocacy in Washington for most of that time. I first encountered the organization when I was a college student, then later was on the board of directors, and then came to lead the organization in 2017. And so for many decades, because our work has been committed to religious freedom for all people and understanding how the separation of church and state actually protects religious freedom for all people, and living into some of our Baptist distinctives and Baptist history of standing up for separation of church and state, we were kind of actively trying to correct this mythology of America as a Christian nation for several decades. So familiar with the language of America as a Christian nation, familiar with the language of Christian nationalism. But I think for me, my like toggle switch moment, of like, this is not just one of many issues we need to be focused on, but this really needs to move to be a top priority, was the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in October of 2018, and which remains the deadliest attack on a Jewish population in U.S. history, where worshipers were killed during their their Shabbat services on a Saturday morning. By a gunman who was armed not just with deadly weapons, but also this deadly ideology of Christian nationalism, of, in his mind, who belongs here and who doesn't, and who is a threat to U.S. values because of their religion in this case. And to me, there was a through line to prior violence, including violence in Charlottesville, around the Unite the Right rally, and the really violent actions there, including the marches and intimidation around synagogues in Charlottesville, and then before that, the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina. That all of these had a common thread of this ideology of Christian nationalism. And that was really the catalytic event, ending with Tree of Life, that spurred the creation of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a campaign that's coordinated by Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, but we do it ecumenically. We do it with a number of other Christian partners. And the impetus for naming it Christians Against Christian Nationalism was actually our interfaith friends, who agreed with us that this was a deadly and urgent problem, but said, look, it's Christians who really need to be the leaders in calling out Christian nationalism, because it's a problem that's infecting your communities mostly. And it's also, you have the right voice to try to explain to people how this is not Christianity as you understand it. This is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. But also they said, we just simply don't feel safe in the United States today to call out Christian nationalism with the force that it needs to be called out. And so it was that work that kind of really put me personally, but also the organization and the groups that we work with on this trajectory. And then the right after that, kind of to answer your question when you're like, that's Christian nationalism, it was January 6, 2021. It was immediately recognizable with those truly unbelievable images we saw of people attacking the U.S. Capitol and trying to overthrow the results of the 2020 election. The use of the images of Christianity, but they were really images of Christian nationalism to try to justify the violence. I think, to this date, I can't kind of point to a more graphic example of Christian nationalism in modern times, right? I think we can look to the past, we can look to images of KKK terrorism and violence. Those were also very stark images of Christian nationalism. But in our present day, I think January 6, 2021.
That was a moment for me that it kind of solidified, like, it was almost like an apocalypse, a revelation. Like, there's the underbelly finally exposed. For me, like my first, like, oh, this is some weird Christian nationalism thing. Like, I grew up in like that whole culture of, that white evangelical nationalistic perspective was the best one. And if we just had all the power, then we'd be okay. So I can see the evolution going all the way back in my childhood from the preachers that, my dad used to watch on TV all the way up to, when Donald Trump was elected. But the one thing I didn't understand, and maybe you can help me see, is we were always so like moralistic, like James Dobson, family values, moralistic, like family, all that stuff. And then, like, how did Donald Trump, who's this billionaire real estate playboy from downtown New York, like, adopt the Christian right, family values kind of a thing? This is still something that I'm struggling to understand, even if people try to justify it here and there for me. Like, I cannot build a bridge between those things. Have you ever been able to build a bridge between those two things?
Well, I mean, to me, it comes down to power, right? And I think, honestly, if I look back on kind of moral majority days, Christian coalition, like when white evangelicals were amassing political power, that's what they were doing, right? Maybe they were using moralistic arguments, but they were picking and choosing even then between which causes they were going to be mostly pushing. And of course, it was mostly an anti-abortion agenda during that time, not exclusively, but I think that was a galvanizing issue, and one that was very intentionally selected in the 1970s. Famously, it wasn't before Roe v. Wade or even immediately after Roe v. Wade that became the unifying issue. And I'm not, the historian, the expert on this, but I've read and heard a lot about this, that it actually in many cases was a reaction against desegregation, including desegregation in Christian communities, that was really propelling political action, but that wasn't politically salient, right? They couldn't say, our cause is to resegregate the schools, but instead kind of chose this other issue and became kind of using that as the vehicle for amassing political power. So I don't see a huge disconnect between that and then being willing to sacrifice their commitment to those issues in order to continue to be in service of political power. And for many people who have been part of that movement, they see their political calculuses having paid off, because President Trump did appoint justices to the U.S. Supreme Court who provided a majority to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that was kind of where they started their advocacy, and they saw the culmination of that and are now seeing laws across this country to ban abortion in ways that are really putting women's health in jeopardy. So I just see it all as part of the same fabric of being willing to sacrifice theological convictions, including how we comport ourselves in the political world in service of power.
We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. Ministry leaders, how do you heal from the burnout, loneliness, and the relentless weight of leadership? Kaneo Center exists for you. For 5 years, Kaneo has walked with over 500 ministry leaders through their darkest seasons, offering a rare blend of compassionate coaching, therapeutically informed practices, and Jesus-centered renewal. Kaneo is launching new 24-week cohorts now, where you'll join a small group of leaders for weekly video coaching, guided curriculum, and reflections to rebuild your resilience. The cohort all ends with a retreat in Puerto Rico. As a Kaneo coach myself, I've seen how this space transforms lives. And for Liminal Living listeners, mention Liminal in your application at thecaneocenter.com/cohort to claim $100 off your cohort experience. You've poured into others, let Kaneo pour into you. If you're in a dark night or deconstruction, you know how vital it is to ground yourself in intentional practice. That's why I'm thrilled to partner with the Monk Manual, a journaling system inspired by monastic wisdom and backed by science. The Monk Manual is a daily journal companion for reflection, purpose, and aligning your actions with your deepest values. Whether you're rebuilding after deconstruction or seeking clarity in transition, this tool turns liminality into grounded growth. And now, Liminal Living listeners can save 10% on their Monk Manual using the code LIMINAL over at monkmanual.com/liminal. And remember, the wisdom of liminal spaces lies in how we journey through them. So do it with intention. And now back to our show. You've kind of been hinting at one of the major threads of Christian nationalism, and that would be like a white supremacy. Now, we've talked about segregation. Like, can you pull on that thread a little bit more? Is there a beginning point that we're going to see, like, Christian nationalism has its roots in white supremacy, and then how it then just kind of cloaks itself in, religious ideology? Is it all the same thing? Is it just another form of white supremacy, or is it just one of the ingredients?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the U.S. context, we can point back to the doctrine of discovery, which was this deadly heresy that used Christian scripture to say that it was God's will for European conquerors to travel to the quote-unquote New World, right, and to steal native land, and to, either push them aside or kill if necessary in order to take over the land, that was God's will for the world. So really subjugating Christian scripture and Christian values to power, and how there was inherent white supremacy, European white supremacy inherent in that way of thinking. And then that just continued with choices that were made by colonial powers. So the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, and then to legalize slavery, even in political spaces that were explicitly religious. So like in the colony of Virginia, the Anglican Church was the established church of the empire, and citizenship and religion were completely tied together in that system. That was a Christian nationalist system in that way. And the Virginia Assembly was made entirely of Anglican men, and they voted in the 17th century that a person's baptism would not free them from enslavement. And so they literally took a Christian idea and subjugated it to power, and particularly white supremacist power at that time. And so, we have these very deep roots. And then if we look at the founding period itself, the only people who held full rights of citizenship at the founding of the United States were white Protestant men who owned property. Everyone else was, a second, third, or lower class citizen, or even not counted as a citizen at all in the early days. And so that framework, right, and then to layer onto it God's providence or God's will, to claim the United States as a Christian nation, to claim that, for instance, as some do, that the founding documents themselves were divinely inspired, then you put God's, God's seal of approval on all of that white supremacy and racism and subjugation as well. And so I think it is so deeply entwined in American history, but also in this ideology that we can't fully pull it out. And so part of really understanding and raising our own awareness about Christian nationalism is grappling honestly with the white supremacy that's inherent in a lot of these ideas, that the Christian in Christian nationalism is not so much about the teachings of Jesus or even a particular Christian theology, but rather is this ethno-national identity of whiteness. And if we can't fully grapple with that and deal honestly with that, then I don't think we're going to have much progress in dismantling Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and they're trying to pull out any of the vocabulary and verbiage around addressing that directly from, national documents where you're not allowed to mention, certain words now in certain spaces of the government. And how are we going to, I even have friends that will say, every time you talk about this, you make me feel bad for being a white guy. And I have a hard time communicating. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the water you're swimming in, kind of a thing. Is there a way that you can bring this topic to kind of that white male-centered person that maybe is a little more palatable, and they're not just going to totally reject it because, once I see it, I can't unsee it, and then I'm having a hard time helping other people see it because they immediately get offended when I bring it up, and I don't know how to bridge that gap of now I'm offended because you mentioned that I'm white, kind of a thing. Have you found any tools to help you cross the bridge?
Well, I think you're doing the right thing in just even being in conversation about it, right? Because I think, we've seen this incredible attack on an honest telling of history, and also, from the federal government level, an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I think part of the backlash we're seeing against that right now is that we can't policy our way out of this problem, right? We're not going to have not that the policies themselves are bad policies, but they're so deeply entrenched that that people are kind of responding in these really unproductive ways. And so I think the best way is really for communities and, in our context, congregations willing to deal with truth, right? That should be, I think, a Christian value, and willing to be unsettled by it, right? I think we have, I think not that people should feel bad themselves, but I think they should feel some sort of lament about what's happened in our country and how that continues to have ripple effects to the present day that result in inequality across our society, right? Inequality that hits all different groups in all different ways. But part of the problem is we've never honestly dealt with the trauma and the shame and the violence that was perpetrated in the past, right? And so it's up to us to be willing to build those relationships and have those conversations today. And we can't promise that people aren't going. I would be concerned if people, learned about the past and didn't have some kind of negative feelings associated with it. But think about all the negative feelings that people who have been, really most vulnerable to discrimination and oppression, think about the feelings that they've had, right? That we don't. And so I think there is a real fragility in white culture about really learning and grappling with some of the harder and more violent aspects of our past. And I just don't think we can, assure or promise people that they won't ever have negative feelings about these things. That's not really a good way to approach the topic. And I'm particularly troubled with what we're seeing happening with public school curriculum, that there is this erasure of the uncomfortable and violent aspects of American past, as if those are somehow threatening. And I guess they are threatening to a Christian nation mythology. If you prefer mythology to history, then the truth is threatening to that. But
that was a powerful phrase right there. Wow.
And I think a lot of people would rather have a mythology of the United States than an actual history.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's profound. I'm going to be thinking about that one for a long time. Wow. I had a conversation, this is years ago, probably, I would want to say probably 2013, 2014, somewhere in there. I was working for a church plant. It was a small startup in a coffee house. And I was like one of the pastors on staff, and I was paid part-time, and I would come and sit in the coffee house for 7 hours, and people would come and go, and I'd do my office work there, but mostly I was meeting with people. And I remember we were just kind of sitting around a table having coffee, and somebody brought up slavery, and they didn't even, there wasn't a lot of commentary on it, just about the effects of slavery today in the modern day. How they still ripple effect. And this one woman at the table, she just lost it. She stood up and just started yelling with a finger pointing, and just like really, like that was not the tone of the conversation until that moment, kind of a thing. And she was yelling, "That wasn't me. I didn't do that stuff. You can't hold me accountable for that." And she lost it, and then she sat back down, and she's like sweating and just like breathing heavy. And I looked at her, and I just said, "I think that's the most passionate I've seen you get about any topic we've ever talked about, even your faith and even Jesus. And I'd like to know why." And that disarmed her in that moment. Just like, why did I just do that? Why did I just say that? I think there's like these force fields we put around ourselves where we're going to protect ourselves from the uncomfortable feelings of, guilt and shame that we might feel if we talk about certain things, because we're so deeply identified with whiteness instead of as an ethnicity, but as like a cultural reality, like I am this. So if you criticize this, you're criticizing me. And it's really hard to separate out whiteness from the white person and say, I'm not talking about you as a white person. I'm talking about the whiteness that pervades our society that we all participate in some fashion. Mm-hmm. And that was a moment for me that was kind of eye-opening. Like, wow, this is a really inflaming issue. And that was before, everything got so polarized in, the 2015 nominations and 2016 elections and all that kind of stuff. And it's only gotten worse, I think.
Yeah. I mean, kind of where that takes me, that's such a powerful memory and story. I try to have some free time where I read literature, and I finally read James, which won the National Book Award last year by Percival Everett. So it's a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but from the perspective of the enslaved person, Jim in Huckleberry Finn and James in this novel. Incredible book, entertaining, so well written, imaginative, and incredibly violent. And this is just this. There's sometimes art and literature can have a way, I think, sometimes of opening places for conversation that just talking about history necessarily can close things off, right? And so really living in this world for the couple of weeks when I was reading the book and listening to the audiobook at the same time, it just showed me just the depth of the national trauma, right, that continues to this day. Yes, absolutely, for the enslaved population, but also for the enslavers, right? And the trauma of living through this incredibly violent time that has never been dealt with. And sometimes I think we see the trauma coming out like in outbursts like that we don't even understand where they came from, right? Mm-hmm. And that part of this is just, it requires us to, in community, to live and talk to each other about, about the past, but how that's continuing to show up in the way we deal with it right now. And we are, as a country, moving so far back in this moment by, again, refusing to face honestly and I think patriotically, honestly. If we love our country, we love it enough to tell the truth about it and to be willing to want more for us. That's what we need right now, and not to be shutting down and banning topics or content or books that make us think differently and maybe with some difficulty about our past and our continuing obligations in the present and the future.
Yeah. Well, this is a really hard time to be here. I've had a lot of autoimmune flare-ups because of the stress, because of the lack of sleep, because of everything going on. It's been really, really hard, and I'm trying to do the practices that will kind of ground me in some healthy things. What is giving you hope right now in the midst of all of the crazy?
Yeah. I don't get hope from my devices and my feeds and in my inbox. I get hope from human connection and conversation. So conversations like this one for sure. But also, I spend a lot of my time out in the community all over the country, talking with people about Christian nationalism, but also envisioning what a different future could look like. And I'm finding that in these days that are so difficult, hundreds of people are showing up when I go and speak, and they are getting a sense of community and energy from just their presence in person, with other people in this work. And then I'm sensing a real desire to continue it. It's not just a one-off, let me go listen to this speaker, but actually what could we continue to do in our community? And it's very inspiring to me in this moment that in these very dark days that we may be part of really a renewal of community in this country, maybe even creating something that's never existed before. And to be even a very small part of that is giving me a lot of hope.
Well, that's good. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I think you're doing really important work, even though it's really difficult work. Thank you for your work out there, being a voice, trying to help steer the ship in a different direction. Where do you want to send people to connect with your work and what you do?
Yeah, so people can find out lots more about us on a few different websites, bjconline.org, christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, and endchristiannationalism.com. The last one is kind of the landing page for my recent book, How to End Christian Nationalism. And on all of these sites, we have more information about how to get more engaged in your community to push back against Christian nationalism, with lots of resources that are free to download and that you can use for discussion and growth.
Awesome. Well, I will put those links down in the comments for anyone who wants to just click on them. They'll be easy to find. You just click and you're there. So thank you again for coming on the show. I've learned a lot, and you've given me some hope today, and I needed that. So thank you for that gift.
Oh, thanks, Tom. It's been a great time for me as well.